March 1974. Lintong District, Xi'an. The air is dry, filled with the yellow dust of the Loess Plateau, the same earth that has nourished and buried dynasties for millennia. There is no sound of imperial grandeur, only the rhythmic scrape and thud of simple tools against the unforgiving ground as a group of farmers attempt to dig a well. Then, a different sound. Not the dull thud of earth or the grating scrape on rock, but a sharp, resonant crack, like striking a massive piece of pottery. A moment of confusion, a pause in the labor. Curiosity overcomes exhaustion. As they dig around the obstruction, the earth gives way, revealing not a boulder, but a face. A human face sculpted from terracotta, its expression a mixture of stoicism and fierce loyalty, its eyes staring out from a darkness that has held it captive for over 2,100 years. This is not the discovery of a single statue. This is the pulling of a single thread that unravels a hidden world. As archaeologists descend into the gloom, their lamps cut through the subterranean night, revealing a sight that defies reason. A soldier, then 10 soldiers, then a phalanx, then a legion. An entire army, crafted from clay, standing in perfect battle formation, thousands of them disappearing into the unexcavated blackness. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth, ancient dust, and something else. An almost electric sense of stillness, the feeling of a colossal will frozen in time. Each soldier is an individual with unique features, hairstyles, and armor, a silent census of a vanished empire. This is the sensory assault of the impossible. An underground kingdom, a buried army, a silent, eternal parade waiting for a command that will never come. This is the legacy, the tomb, the prison of the man who created them. This is the first glimpse into the soul of a king who sought to conquer death itself. This is the narrative of him, Ying Zheng, the man who would shatter the ages and forge a new name for himself from the fire of conquest and the dust of crushed kingdoms. Qin Shi Huang, the first sovereign emperor of Qin. To understand this man, to comprehend the scale of his ambition and the depth of his terror, we must stand in this subterranean field of silent warriors and ask the core question that echoes in the darkness. How? How did a ruler of such immense, world-altering power, the man who unified the warring states, who built the Great Wall, who standardized language and law and created the very blueprint of the nation we now call China, become so utterly enslaved by the fear of his own ending? How did his quest for immortality, his war against the natural order, lead him not to eternal life, but to this? Becoming the eternal prisoner of his own magnificent, terrifying tomb, he defeated every king, every army, every rival that stood against him, only to wage a desperate, losing war against his own mortality. A war whose chief monument was this very army, a testament not to his power over death, but to its absolute power over him. The story of Qin Shi Huang is not merely the story of the birth of an empire. It is the story of a man who, in his attempt to become a god, became a ghost haunting his own creation, forever trapped between the world he built and the abyss he so desperately feared. To find the answer, we must return to the world that spawned him, a world drenched in blood and defined by chaos. To understand the first emperor, we must first understand the world that forged him. The China of the late Warring States period, a brutal and chaotic epoch that had lasted for over 250 years. This was not a world of chivalrous contests between noble houses. It was a geopolitical slaughterhouse, a continental crucible where 7 major kingdoms, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei, were locked in a Darwinian struggle for ultimate survival. Imagine the Peloponnesian War, but stretched over centuries and magnified across a landscape vaster than Europe, fought with a savagery that would make the condottieri of Renaissance Italy blush. This was an age of existential warfare, where victory meant not just conquest, but the complete and utter annihilation of the enemy's state, culture, and identity. The old Zhou dynasty, a hollowed-out vessel of spiritual authority, was long dead in all but name, and in its place was a vacuum of power filled by bloodshed. While in the West, the successors of Alexander the Great, the Diadochi, were carving up his empire, and the nascent Roman Republic was beginning its slow, methodical conquest of the Italian peninsula. The kingdoms of ancient China were perfecting the art of mass warfare. Armies numbered not in the tens of thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands. Crossbows with intricate bronze trigger mechanisms could shower battalions with deadly bolts, while iron-tipped halberds and swords turned battlefields into churning meat grinders. The statecraft was just as ruthless, a world of shifting alliances, betrayals, and sophisticated espionage that would have been intimately familiar to Machiavelli. It was this environment, this relentless, unforgiving political reality, that shaped the philosophy of Qin. Legalism, the state ideology of Qin, was a direct response to this chaos, a belief that human nature is fundamentally self-serving and that the only way to forge a strong state is through absolute centralized authority and harsh, unyielding laws. This was the world into which Yingzheng was born, not a world of gods and heroes, but a world of wolves. The forging of Qin Shi Huang's character began not in a palace of splendor, but in the gilded cage of a political hostage. This was his ancestral curse. He was born around the year 259 before the Common Era in Handan, the capital of the rival state of Zhao, a place where the name of Qin was despised. His father, Zichu, was a minor Qin prince of no great importance, living in Zhao as a political guarantee against Qin aggression, a pawn in the great game. Yingzheng's very existence was precarious, a life lived under the constant, simmering threat of execution should relations between the two states sour. But the humiliation ran deeper, poisoning the very root of his identity. His mother, Zhao Ji, had been a concubine, a beautiful dancer gifted to his father by an ambitious merchant named Lu Buwei. It was Lu who, through brilliant political maneuvering, would eventually see Zichu placed on the throne of Qin, but the rumors followed them relentlessly. That Lu Buwei was Yingzheng's true biological father, that the future emperor was not a true scion of the Qin royal house, but the bastard son of a merchant. This cloud of illegitimacy and shame would hang over him for his entire life, fueling a deep-seated insecurity and an insatiable hunger to prove his legitimacy through unparalleled achievement. His childhood was a masterclass in paranoia, a lesson in the fragility of life and the treachery of men. He learned to watch, to listen, to trust no one. This crucible of fear and humiliation did not break him. It tempered him into a weapon. It instilled in him a profound hatred for weakness, a contempt for the convoluted rituals of the old aristocracy, and a burning conviction that the only true security lay not in alliances or lineage, but in absolute, indivisible, and terrifying power. The boy who grew up a prisoner in a hostile land would one day return the favor, turning all of China into a state governed by the same principles of fear and control that had defined his own youth. At the tender age of 13, In the year 246 before the Common Era, the boy Yingzheng ascended to the throne of Qin, the most ruthlessly efficient military state of the age. But to be king is not the same as to rule. His first step into the great game was as a silent puppet, a ceremonial figurehead overshadowed by the two figures who had engineered his rise and now controlled his world. The first was the man who was either his greatest benefactor or his biological father, the Chancellor Lu Buwei. A master strategist of immense intellect and ambition, Lu Buwei had orchestrated the boy king's return from Zhao and his installation on the throne, and now he governed the state as regent, the true power behind the dragon throne. He compiled the Lushi Chunkyu, an encyclopedic text of philosophy, aiming to create a cultural foundation for the state that would rival the intellectual traditions of the other kingdoms. He was, in essence, grooming Qin for greatness, with himself as its guiding sage. The second and more scandalous power was the king's own mother, the Queen Dowager Zhao Ji. Freed from the constraints of her life in Zhao, she indulged in her newfound power, taking a lover named Lao Ai, a man smuggled into the palace disguised as a eunuch. She even bore him 2 secret sons. The young king was trapped, a silent observer in his own court, forced to watch as his regent father figure ruled in his name and his mother engaged in a decadent affair that threatened the stability and honor of the entire royal house. But this period of forced passivity was his true education. He watched the intricate dance of court politics. He saw how Lu Buwei manipulated factions and managed the complex machinery of the state, and he felt the sting of his own powerlessness. He was learning, calculating, and nursing a cold, patient resentment. The wolves surrounding him thought they had a docile lamb in their midst, but they were unknowingly cultivating a dragon, one who was merely waiting for the moment to shed his skin and incinerate them all. Beneath the surface of political maneuvering and youthful patience, a deeper, more fundamental motivation was taking root in the young king's soul. This was his inner demon, a pathological obsession with order and permanence, born directly from the chaotic uncertainty of his early life. His experience as a hostage in Zhao, the whispers about his parentage, the treacherous politics of his own court, all of these experiences instilled in him a profound and abiding terror of disorder. The world as he saw it was a fundamentally chaotic and violent place, a maelstrom of shifting loyalties and inevitable decay. The philosophies of the other states, especially the Confucian emphasis on tradition, family loyalty, and decentralized feudal virtue, seemed to him nothing more than a recipe for the very weakness and disunity that had plagued the land for centuries. His ambition, therefore, was not simply the classic desire for conquest and glory. It was a quasi-religious quest to impose an absolute, unshakable, and eternal order on the human world. He didn't just want to defeat the other 6 states. He wanted to erase the very conditions that allowed them to exist as separate entities. He envisioned a world with one ruler, one law, one system of thought. A world where the possibility of chaos was surgically removed from the body politic. This obsession with control on a geopolitical scale was the macroscopic reflection of the war raging within his own mind. As he grew in power, this abstract desire for political permanence began to metastasize, turning inward and fusing with the most personal and terrifying form of chaos, his own death. The dissolution of the body, the end of consciousness, the loss of control, this was the ultimate enemy. His war against the 6 states was merely a dress rehearsal for his true war, a war against mortality itself. He would build an empire that would last for 10,000 generations, and he, its creator, must also endure for 10,000 generations to oversee it. This was the secret motivation, the psychological engine that would drive him to both unify a nation and descend into a private madness. The fusion of Yingzheng's raw, paranoid ambition with a coherent and terrifyingly effective ideology required a catalyst. That catalyst arrived in the form of a man named Li Si. A brilliant, ambitious, and utterly unsentimental scholar, Li Si was a student of the foremost legalist master, Xunzi, but he rejected his teacher's more moderate Confucian leanings, embracing instead the most ruthless tenets of legalist philosophy. He journeyed to Qin because he saw it for what it was, the only state with the discipline, the ambition, and the lack of moral scruples necessary to conquer all under heaven. He famously argued that a man of talent should not be content with a life of scholarly poverty and inaction, but should seize the moment and attach himself to a powerful ruler in a time of opportunity. Just as a rat in a granary grows fat, while a rat in the latrine remains scrawny. When he gained an audience with the young king, it was a meeting of minds that would change the course of history. Li Si was not a general. He was a political architect. He gave voice and structure to Yingzheng's own nascent feelings. He articulated the philosophy of total war and absolute centralization. He argued that the state's power must be absolute, that laws must be applied to all without exception, and that any competing ideologies, especially the backward-looking morality of the Confucians, were a cancer that must be excised. In Li Si, Yingzheng found not a sycophant, but a fiercely intelligent and pragmatic instrument for his will. In Yingzheng, Li Si found the perfect vessel for his philosophy, a ruler untethered by tradition, driven by immense personal demons and possessing the political will to do what was necessary, no matter how brutal. Their fateful encounter was the moment the theoretical blueprint for tyranny was united with the raw power and personal motivation to build it. From this alliance, the strategy for the unification of China would be born, a strategy of systematic, cold, and calculated destruction. The die was cast. The intellectual foundation for the Qin apocalypse was now firmly in place. The first true demonstration of Yingzheng's character, the moment the boy king vanished and the future emperor revealed his fangs, was not on a foreign battlefield, but within the supposed sanctity of his own court. By the year 238 before the Common Era, at the age of 22, he had reached his majority and was ready to seize the reins of power. The situation with his mother, the Queen Dowager, and her lover, Lao Ai, had spiraled into a full-blown crisis. Lao Ai, emboldened by his influence, had been ennobled as the Marquis of Changqin and had plotted with a faction of officials to place one of his secret sons with the Queen Dowager on the throne. This was not just a palace scandal. It was an act of high treason, a direct challenge to Yingzheng's legitimacy and his life. When the plot was uncovered, the king's response was not merely firm. It was an act of calculated, theatrical brutality designed to terrorize any and all who would oppose him. Lao Ai was captured and suffered the most gruesome of punishments: death by being torn apart by 5 horses. His entire clan was exterminated to the 3rd degree, a chilling message about the price of disloyalty. His 2 secret half-brothers, Yingzheng's own kin, were snatched from their mother and beaten to death in sacks. The Queen Dowager herself was placed under house arrest, stripped of her dignity and power. The purge did not end there. The king then turned his cold gaze upon the man who had guided his entire life, the Chancellor Liu Bui. While not directly implicated in Lao Ai's rebellion, he was tainted by his association with the Queen Dowager, having been the one who initially introduced Lao Ai to her. In a masterful stroke of political ruthlessness, Yingzheng stripped Liu Buwei of his chancellorship and exiled him to a remote fiefdom. A year later, fearing an inevitable and humiliating execution, the man who had made a king, the man rumored to be the emperor's true father, committed suicide by drinking poison. With this single, sweeping act of violence and political maneuvering, Yingzheng had decapitated the two competing power centers in his state. He had paid the ultimate price of power, sacrificing family, sentiment, and gratitude on the altar of absolute control. The message to the other 6 states was unmistakable. If this is how the king of Qin treats his own family, imagine the mercy he will show to his enemies. With his domestic power consolidated, the king of Qin turned his gaze outward to the grand antagonist of his story, the collection of rival kingdoms known simply as the 6 states. This was not a single monolithic enemy, but a complex and fractured hydra, a patchwork of ancient civilizations, each with its own proud history, distinct culture, and deep-seated animosity towards the others. To the south lay the vast, sprawling, and culturally rich state of Chu, with its mystical shamanistic traditions and romantic poetry, a veritable giant with feet of clay. To the east was the wealthy maritime state of Qi, a center of philosophy and commerce, but grown complacent and decadent behind its supposed impregnable borders. In the north, the state of Yan was a hardy frontier kingdom, constantly clashing with nomadic tribes and known for its fierce, if unsophisticated, warriors. And in the central plains were the 3 successor states carved from the ancient Jin kingdom. The powerful military state of Zhao, Qin's most immediate and bitter rival, the strategically vital but smaller state of Wei, and the weakest of the 7, Han, which lay directly in Qin's path of expansion. The conflict between Qin and these 6 states was more than just a struggle for territory. It was a fundamental clash of civilizations. Qin, with its rigid legalist ideology, represented a future of absolute centralized bureaucracy, meritocratic advancement based on military success, and the complete subjugation of the individual to the state. The other 6, to varying degrees, represented the past, a world of feudal aristocracy, traditional Confucian ethics, regional loyalties, and cultural diversity. Qin's strategy, perfected by Li Si and its brilliant generals like Wang Jian and Meng Tian, was to treat this multi-headed beast not as a single entity, but as a series of interconnected weaknesses to be exploited. They would use bribery to corrupt their officials, sow discord to break their alliances, and employ devastating psychological warfare to demoralize their populations, all before the first Qin chariot ever rolled across their borders. The great game was to dismember the world, piece by bloody piece. Even as the Qin war machine began its inexorable advance, a single desperate act of defiance nearly brought the entire enterprise crashing down, and in doing so, forever scarred the psyche of the future emperor. This was his fatal mistake, his psychological breaking point. In the year 227 before the Common Era, the state of Yan, facing imminent invasion, concocted a final, desperate plan. They dispatched an envoy, a man of legendary courage named Jing Ke, to the Qin capital under the guise of presenting a peace offering. The head of a renegade Qin general, and more importantly, a map of the Dukang region, a gesture of complete submission. The king of Qin, confident in his power, granted him an audience in the grand throne room. As the map scroll was slowly, ceremoniously unrolled before the king, a poisoned dagger was revealed, hidden at its very end. In that instant, the formal pomp of the court exploded into primal chaos. Jing Ke seized the dagger and lunged at the king. Panic erupted. The court officials were unarmed by law, and the royal guards were stationed outside in the courtyard, unable to enter without a direct summons from the king. For a terrifyingly long moment, Yingzheng was alone, fighting for his own life. He scrambled around a massive pillar in the hall, dodging the assassin's desperate thrusts. According to the histories, it was a court physician who broke the protocol, striking Jing Ke with his medicine bag and momentarily distracting him. This gave the king the precious seconds he needed to draw his own long, cumbersome ceremonial sword. He slashed at Jing Ke, wounding him in the leg. The crippled assassin made one final defiant gesture, hurling the dagger at the king. It missed, striking the bronze pillar with a loud clang. The guards finally rushed in and cut Jing Ke to pieces. Yingzheng survived, but something inside him broke forever. The attack was a profound personal violation. It proved that despite his armies, his walls, and his power, death could still reach out for him. Not on a battlefield, but in the very heart of his own palace. His fear of death, once a philosophical obsession, now became a visceral, all-consuming paranoia. He understood then that his enemies were not just armies to be conquered, but an ever-present, invisible threat. From this moment on, his quest for physical immortality would intensify into a frantic, desperate obsession. The trauma of Jing Ke's assassination attempt did not make the king of Qin cautious. It made him apocalyptic. The near-fatal encounter was the perfect pretext, the ultimate justification for unleashing the full, unrestrained fury of the Qin war machine. He could now frame his war of conquest, not as naked aggression, but as a righteous campaign to punish treachery and bring order to a wicked and chaotic world. He harnessed the chaos of the moment and turned it into a powerful tool of state. The strategy, advised by Li Si, was a masterpiece of cold, calculated, multi-pronged warfare. It began not with soldiers, but with gold. Qin agents flooded the courts of the other states, bribing key ministers and generals, fostering corruption and sowing dissent from within. They turned allies against each other, spreading disinformation and propaganda to ensure that the 6 states would never again form a united front against him. The state of Han was the first to fall in 230, its strategic position making it a vital stepping stone. Then, he unleashed his vengeance upon the state of Zhao, the land of his humiliating childhood, conquering it in 228. He returned to its capital, Handan, not as a king but as a vengeful god, personally overseeing the execution of all the families who had slighted his own during his youth. One by one, the states fell like dominoes. The northern state of Yan, Jing Ke's homeland, was extinguished in 226. The state of Wei, despite its formidable fortifications, fell in 225 after a Qin army diverted the Yellow River and flooded its capital. The mighty southern giant, Chu, put up the fiercest resistance, but was finally crushed in 223 by a massive Qin army of 600,000 men under the command of the veteran general Wang Jian. The chaos and exhaustion of centuries of warfare had left the 6 states hollowed out and fragile, and the king of Qin, with his singular vision and limitless brutality, was the predator who had arrived to feast on the carrion. The year was 221 before the Common Era. The final domino, the wealthy eastern state of Qi, had surrendered without a fight, its king having been persuaded by Qin's silver-tongued diplomats to lay down his arms. The centuries of bloodshed were over. The warring states period had ended not in a stalemate or a treaty, but in an absolute total victory for the state of Qin. From the northern steppes to the jungles of the south, from the eastern sea to the highlands of the west, all the lands that were considered China were now under the rule of one man. Standing at the pinnacle of his achievement, Yingzheng surveyed the world he had conquered and remade. The title of King, Huang, was now insufficient, too small and too common for a ruler of his stature. He convened his ministers and, after deliberation, created a new title for himself, one that would elevate him above all monarchs who had come before. He took the word Huang from the mythical 3 sovereigns and Dai from the legendary 5 emperors, combining them to create Huangdi, sovereign emperor. And to signify that he was the very beginning of this new eternal order, he prefixed it with Shi, the first. He was Qin Shi Huang, the first sovereign emperor. This was his greatest triumph, a moment that fundamentally altered the course of East Asian history. This was not merely a military conquest or a political unification. In his own mind, it was an act of cosmic reordering. The era of chaos was dead, buried under the foundations of his new centralized empire. The cinematic moment of this declaration was the climax of his life's work. The boy hostage from Zhao now stood as the undisputed master of Tianxia, all under heaven. He had not just won the great game, he had smashed the board and created a new one, with himself as the only player. At the summit of his power, a profound psychological transformation occurred within Qin Shi Huang. His moment of triumph was also his moment of supreme hubris. He no longer saw himself as a mere mortal, but as a unique figure in history, a demigod who had succeeded where countless kings before him had failed. He believed he had imposed the order of the heavens upon the chaotic realm of humanity. This belief manifested in a frenzy of activity aimed at standardizing and controlling every aspect of life in his new empire, a project of social engineering on an unprecedented scale. He decreed that the script used in the state of Qin would become the official script for the entire empire, ensuring that his laws and edicts could be read and understood from one end of his domain to the other. He standardized the axle widths of carts and chariots so that they would fit the ruts of the new imperial road system he was constructing, a vast network that would allow his armies and administrators to move with terrifying speed. He abolished the old currencies of the 6 states, replacing them with a single uniform coinage, round coins with a square hole in the middle. Weights and measures were likewise standardized, ensuring that trade and taxation could be regulated with absolute precision from the capital at Xianyang. This was not just about administrative efficiency. It was a deeply symbolic act. He was erasing the very memory of the old states, grinding their unique cultural identities into a uniform imperial dust. His grand tours of the empire were not merely inspections. They were quasi-religious processions, where he had enormous stone steles erected on sacred mountains, inscribed with propaganda celebrating his own monumental achievements, declaring that his dynasty would last for 10,000 generations. In his mind, he was not just a conqueror, he was a creator, the architect of a new and eternal world. And a creator, he reasoned, should not be subject to the same laws of decay and death as the mortals he ruled. While the emperor's armies had conquered every rival state, a new and more insidious enemy emerged from within his own unified empire. The scholars, particularly those of the Confucian school. These men were his sworn enemy, a close-up antagonist whose weapon was not the sword or spear, but memory and morality. The legalist philosophy of Qin was forward-looking and pragmatic, concerned only with the power of the state and the utility of the law in the present moment. History, for Li Si and the emperor, was a dangerous encumbrance, a collection of stories and precedents that could be used to criticize the new order. The Confucian scholars, by contrast, revered the past. They spoke of the virtues of the ancient sage kings, of the decentralized feudal system of the Zhou dynasty, which they idealized as a golden age of propriety and benevolence. In their subtle and sometimes open critiques, they were holding up a mirror to the Qin regime, and the emperor saw in its reflection not a glorious new beginning, but a brutal tyranny that fell short of the moral standards of the ancestors. Their very existence was a challenge to his legitimacy. At a court banquet in 213 before the Common Era, a prominent Confucian scholar used historical precedent to criticize the emperor's policy of abolishing the feudal aristocracy. This infuriated Li Si, who delivered a fateful memorial to the throne. He argued that these intellectuals used false learning to criticize the present, confusing the minds of the people and undermining the authority of the state. He proposed a radical, terrifying solution. All historical records in private archives, except for those of Qin, should be burned. All copies of the philosophical classics, like the Book of Songs and the Classic of History, should be delivered to the authorities for destruction. Anyone who dared to discuss these ancient texts would be executed. This was the personal drama between the absolute ruler and the power of ideas. He could execute men by the thousand, but he could not kill a thought. This made the scholars his most persistent and frustrating enemy, ghosts from a past he was desperate to erase. In his quest to remake the world and etch his will into the very fabric of the earth, Qin Shi Huang initiated a series of monumental construction projects that dwarfed anything that had come before. This was reform and construction on a mid-level, the physical manifestation of his obsession with control, unity, and permanence. The most famous of these was, of course, the Great Wall. He did not build it from scratch, but connected and reinforced the existing defensive walls built by the northern states of Qin, Zhao, and Yan, creating a single vast line of defense against the nomadic Xiongnu tribes of the steppe. This was a logistical and engineering marvel, a river of stone and earth that snaked for thousands of miles over mountains and through deserts. But it was built at a staggering human cost, conscripting hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of soldiers and laborers, many of whom perished from exhaustion and exposure and were rumored to have been buried within the wall itself, earning it the moniker of the longest cemetery on Earth. At the same time, he commanded the construction of a vast network of imperial highways, over 4,000 miles of roads, all built to a standard width, connecting the capital at Xianyang to the farthest reaches of his empire. These were the arteries of his power, allowing his armies to crush rebellions with unprecedented speed. In the south, he ordered the construction of the Link Canal, a brilliant feat of engineering that connected the Xiang and Li rivers, linking the Yangtze and Pearl River systems for the first time in history, and allowing him to supply his armies for the subjugation of the southern tribes. These projects were a testament to the organizational genius of the Qin state, but they were also a testament to its brutality. The state was a machine, a relentless engine of construction, and the people of the empire were its fuel, their lives and labor consumed to realize the grandiose visions of one man. As the emperor's power grew, his focus shifted from the external world of conquest and construction to the internal world of his own body and its encroaching mortality. This became the great context of his later reign, an all-consuming obsession that overshadowed all other affairs of state. His grand imperial tours were no longer just about inspecting his domain. They became frantic, desperate quests for the elixir of life. He fell under the sway of a succession of magicians, alchemists, and charlatans, each promising to grant him the immortality he so craved. The most famous of these was a court sorcerer named Xu Fu, who told the emperor of three mythical spirit mountains in the Eastern Sea, Penglai, Fangjiang, and Yingzhou, where the immortals lived and where the elixir of life could be found. Believing him completely, Qin Shi Huang dispatched Xu Fu on a grand maritime expedition with a fleet of ships and thousands of young men and women to seek out these mythical islands. They never returned, with some legends claiming they settled in ancient Japan. The emperor's personal life, his family and potential heirs, seemed to vanish from the historical record, completely subsumed by his singular focus on his own survival. We know little of his empress or his concubines. His sons, including the heir apparent Fusu, are mentioned only in relation to their political roles. His was a world devoid of personal intimacy or familial warmth. Every human interaction was transactional, every person a tool or an obstacle in his quest to defeat death. He surrounded himself with physicians who prescribed him pills made of cinnabar, mercury sulfide, believing that the liquid, living nature of mercury could bestow longevity. In a tragic irony, the very potions he consumed to preserve his life were likely slowly poisoning him, degrading his physical health, and perhaps even contributing to his escalating paranoia and volatile temper. His was a world populated not by family and friends, but by the ghosts of his enemies and the tantalizing, ever-receding promise of eternal life. The immense pressure exerted by the emperor's tyranny, the crushing taxes, the brutal forced labor, the suppression of all dissent, began to create fissures in the monolithic edifice of his empire. The first cracks in his eternal dynasty began to appear, harbingers of the storm that would engulf it the moment he was gone. The most infamous and revealing of these cracks was the incident known as the burning of the books and burying of the scholars. Following Li Si's advice to crush intellectual dissent, in the year 212 before the Common Era, the emperor took his war against the past to its horrifying conclusion. According to the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, after being deceived by two alchemists who had failed to find the elixir of life, the emperor flew into a rage. He ordered an investigation of the scholars in the capital, and when it was determined that over 460 of them had violated his decrees, he had them all executed, not by the sword, but by being buried alive in a common pit. This act, whether historically precise or exaggerated by later propagandists, symbolizes a regime gripped by profound insecurity. It was the desperate, brutal act of a man who understood that his new order was fragile, that it could be undermined by the simple recitation of an ancient poem or the telling of a historical tale. It revealed a deep-seated fear that his entire system, built on force and the erasure of memory, was fundamentally illegitimate and could not withstand intellectual scrutiny. These were not the actions of a confident demigod, but of a paranoid tyrant terrified of the ghosts of history. The whispers of the dispossessed aristocracy, the sullen resentment of the peasantry laboring on his grand projects, and the silent condemnation of the educated elite were creating a pressure cooker of hatred that would explode the moment the iron fist of the emperor was removed. He had sown the wind, and his dynasty would reap the whirlwind. Amidst the growing paranoia and the frantic search for immortality, the emperor made a fateful act, a psychological pivot that would define his entire legacy. He began to pour the vast resources of his empire into the construction of his own tomb. This was not merely a final resting place. It was to be his eternal palace, a subterranean empire where he would continue to rule for all time. Located near modern-day Xi'an, the mausoleum complex became the central project of his reign, a monumental undertaking that, according to Sima Qian, involved over 700,000 conscripted laborers working for decades. The psychology behind this decision reveals a critical shift in his thinking. It was a tacit admission that his quest for physical immortality in this world might fail. The mausoleum was his ultimate insurance policy, a grand and arrogant refusal to submit to the oblivion of death. If he could not live forever, he would create a perfect, unchanging, eternal reality in the afterlife. The tomb was designed as a microcosm of his dominion. Its central chamber, still unexcavated, is said to contain a replica of his empire, with rivers and seas modeled in flowing mercury, and the constellations of the heavens depicted on the ceiling in pearls. It was to be protected by automated crossbows set to fire on any intruder. And to guard this eternal kingdom, he commissioned the most extraordinary feature of all, the Terracotta army. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each with individual features, were created and placed in pits surrounding the tomb, a permanent, undecaying army to protect him and enforce his will in the afterlife. This fateful act was the ultimate expression of his inner demon. He was no longer just the ruler of the living. He was preparing, with meticulous and obsessive detail, for his coronation as the Emperor of the Dead. It was a project born of supreme hubris and profound fear, a testament to a man who would rather rule in hell than cease to rule at all. The final years of the first emperor's reign were not a period of glorious twilight, but a descent into a private hell of his own making. The greatest catastrophe of his life was not a military defeat or a political rebellion, but a slow, creeping, and absolute psychological collapse. His paranoia, ignited by the assassination attempt of Jing Ke and fueled by his legalist worldview of human nature as inherently treacherous, became a raging inferno that consumed his mind. He became a phantom in his own empire, a ghost haunting the corridors of his many palaces. Fearing assassination at every turn, he rarely slept in the same room for 2 consecutive nights. He had elevated walkways and walled roads built between his palaces so that he could move about without being seen by the public. He became obsessed with secrecy, decreeing that anyone who revealed his whereabouts would be immediately executed. Sima Qian relates a story where the emperor, from a vantage point, expressed annoyance at the large retinue of his chancellor, Li Si. When a nearby eunuch later informed Li Si of the emperor's displeasure, the chancellor reduced his entourage. The enraged emperor, realizing someone had leaked his private comment, interrogated his attendants. When no one would confess, he had every single person who had been near him at that moment arrested and executed. He had conquered and unified the known world, only to become a terrified prisoner within it, isolated by his own power. He was haunted by dreams of vengeful spirits, the ghosts of the millions whose lives he had destroyed. He was no longer the master of his empire. He was a slave to his own terror, a solitary, tormented figure flitting between shadows, forever looking over his shoulder for the assassin's blade or the whisper of a ghost. The man who had demanded absolute order had created a world of absolute fear, and he himself was its chief resident. The final collapse began during the emperor's last great tour of his empire in 210 before the Common Era. This was his last chance, a final, desperate pilgrimage in search of a miracle. He was no longer the vibrant conqueror, but a physically ailing man, likely suffering from the cumulative effects of mercury poisoning from the elixirs of life he so faithfully consumed. As he traveled through the eastern territories, He was still chasing the whispers of immortality, making inquiries about the magician Shu Fu and the mythical Isle of Penglai, a dream that had long since curdled into a bitter obsession. He fell gravely ill while in Pingyuan, but as the master of all under heaven, he despised any mention of death. His ministers dared not even speak of making arrangements for the future of the empire. The ultimate irony was descending upon him. The man who had spent decades meticulously planning his own eternal afterlife had made no stable provision for the succession of his earthly empire. His eldest son and heir apparent, the capable and level-headed Fusu, had long been at odds with him. Fusu had dared to criticize his father's brutality, particularly the burying of the scholars, and for this, he had been exiled to the northern frontier to supervise the construction of the Great Wall under the command of General Meng Tian. As the emperor's life ebbed away in a palace pavilion in Shakyu, far from the capital, the final pathetic collapse unfolded. The emperor who had built an eternal empire was dying, and the fate of that empire now rested in the hands of the three men who stood by his deathbed: his chief eunuch, the treacherous Zhao Gao; his chancellor, the once brilliant but now fatally compromised Li Si; and his youngest, most pliable son, Hu Hai. The great unifier was about to leave his creation in the hands of schemers who would tear it apart. In the 7th month of the year 210 before the Common Era, in a remote palace far from his capital, the man who had remade the world died. But the hero's finale was not one of glory, but of squalid, pathetic secrecy. The first sovereign emperor, the demigod who commanded 1,000,000 soldiers and sought to live for 10,000 years, died an isolated, ignominious death. The two men who held his fate in their hands, Chancellor Li Si and the chief eunuch Zhao Gao, faced a terrifying predicament. The heir, Fusu, was in the north with the loyal General Meng Tian and their powerful army. Fusu despised them both. If he ascended the throne, their own lives would be forfeit. And so, in a final audacious act of treachery, they made a decision. They would conceal the emperor's death. They forged a decree from the dead emperor, ordering both Fusu and General Meng Tian to commit suicide for their disloyalty. They then placed the emperor's youngest and most incompetent son, Hu Hai, on the throne as a puppet, becoming the second emperor. The great problem was how to transport the emperor's body back to the capital, a journey of several weeks in the blistering summer heat, without anyone discovering the truth. The cinematic description of his final journey is one of grotesque irony. As Qin Shi Huang's corpse began to decompose in his ornate carriage, the stench became overwhelming. To mask the smell of his decaying mortal flesh, Zhao Gao ordered that carts filled with salted, rotting fish be brought to travel alongside the imperial procession, announcing to all that it was merely the emperor's wish to have a taste of seafood. And so, the man who craved permanence above all else, the ruler who built a tomb to preserve his form for eternity, was paraded across the empire he had created as a putrefying secret, his divine presence mimicked by the stink of rotting fish. It was a final, cosmic joke, a fittingly grim end to a life spent in a futile war against nature itself. For the next 2 millennia, the legacy of Qin Shi Huang was shaped almost entirely by his enemies, particularly the Confucian scholars of the succeeding Han Dynasty. In their histories, he was cast as the ultimate villain, an inhuman monster of boundless cruelty and hubris, a book-burning, scholar-burying tyrant whose brutal reign was a dark aberration in the civilized flow of Chinese history. This was the dominant interpretation, the conflict of interpretations leaning heavily towards condemnation. He was the man who had destroyed the benevolent feudal system, who had replaced morality with fear, and whose dynasty, which he had boasted would last for 10,000 generations, collapsed in a firestorm of rebellion a mere 3 years after his death. His name became a byword for tyranny. However, in the turbulent political climate of the 20th century, a dramatic reevaluation began to take place. As China struggled to cast off the humiliation of foreign domination and forge a new, strong, centralized national identity, Qin Shi Huang was resurrected from the dustbin of history and recast as a national hero. He was now seen as the great unifier, the bold visionary, who had the courage to do what was necessary to end centuries of division and create the very concept of a unified Chinese state. He was the founder, the man who had laid the institutional groundwork upon which every subsequent dynasty was built. This reevaluation reached its zenith under Mao Zedong, who openly admired the first emperor's ruthlessness and even boasted of having surpassed him, declaring, "He buried 460 scholars alive. We have buried 46,000 scholars alive." So, who was he? The brutal tyrant whose actions were an unforgivable crime against humanity and culture? Or the necessary founder, the ruthless surgeon whose painful, bloody work was essential to save the patient from the cancer of perpetual civil war? The conflict of interpretations continues to this day, a testament to a legacy so monumental that it remains impossible to neatly categorize as simply good or evil. We now return to the core question, the central dramatic paradox of a man who conquered the world only to be imprisoned by his fear of leaving it. How did Qin Shi Huang, the defeater of death in his own mind, become its ultimate prisoner? The final, comprehensive answer lies not in his stars, but in his character, forged in the crucible of his youth. He became a prisoner of death because he saw mortality not as an intrinsic part of life, but as an external enemy, another rival state to be besieged, starved, and conquered through overwhelming force and clever strategy. His entire life was a testament to the idea that the human will, his will, could triumph over any obstacle. He had imposed order on the chaos of the warring states. Surely he could impose order on the biological chaos of his own cells. But death is not an external kingdom. It is a fifth column already inside the gates, an internal certainty woven into the fabric of our being. His refusal to accept this fundamental truth was his fatal flaw. The fear of chaos that drove him to unify China was the same fear that drove him to seek immortality. But when applied to his own mortality, this fear became a poison. Instead of finding peace in his accomplishments, his later years were a frantic, paranoid scramble to build a fortress against the inevitable. The more he fought death, the more power he gave it over his life. Every alchemist's failed potion, every unanswered prayer to the immortals, only deepened his terror. His mausoleum, his magnificent terracotta army, was not a symbol of his coming victory over death. It was the ultimate concession of his defeat. It was a monument to his fear. He built a tomb to keep death out, but he only succeeded in creating the perfect, eternal prison to lock himself inside with his own terror. He did not defeat death. He simply made it his eternal jailer. What, then, is the verdict of history? What is the universal lesson to be drawn from the epic saga of the first emperor? His life stands as a timeless and terrifying parable about the paradox of absolute power and the corrosive nature of fear. It is the ultimate story of how the quest for permanence can lead to the most profound and ruinous form of self-destruction. Qin Shi Huang's tragedy was that he achieved a goal of world historical proportions, the unification of a civilization, but at the cost of his own humanity. He succeeded in creating an empire of unprecedented order and scale. But the same obsessive need for control that allowed him to build it also compelled him to try and conquer the one thing no human can command: mortality. His story is a warning that echoes through the ages. The pursuit of absolute control inevitably leads to a state of absolute fear, because the more you control, the more you have to lose. He demonstrates that a leader who tries to erase the past and command the future will ultimately become a prisoner of his own paranoid present. He unified a nation, but he did so by declaring war on human nature itself, on its diversity, its memory, and its finitude. The final philosophical conclusion is that true permanence is found not in walls of stone or armies of clay, but in the acceptance of life's transient nature. By refusing to accept his end, Qin Shi Huang poisoned every moment of his extraordinary life, transforming his magnificent triumph into a private, agonizing defeat. He is the eternal emperor of a subterranean kingdom of ghosts, a ruler who won the entire world, but lost his own soul in the bargain. The final frame is not of the man, but of his shadow. We descend once more into the pits of Lintong, the camera gliding silently over the endless ranks of his eternal army. The low light catches the contours of their faces, thousands of them, each one a unique portrait of a long-dead subject, a silent testament to the colossal will that summoned them into being. Archers kneel, their crossbows ready. Charioteers stand poised at the reins of phantom horses. Infantrymen stand in perfect, disciplined rows, staring forward into an eternity of darkness. There is no sound but the whisper of air currents in the vast subterranean space. This is the empire of silence. The delicious kebab, the final lingering taste of this saga, is the chilling realization that this army is not facing outward to protect its master from the world. It is facing inward, a silent clay phalanx standing eternal guard over a single prisoner. It is the physical manifestation of one man's paranoia, a legion forged from fear, tasked with fighting a war that can never be won. The shadow of the first emperor is not the shadow of a conqueror or a unifier. It is the long, dark shadow of a man who, in his desperate flight from death, ran straight into its cold, unforgiving embrace and pulled the whole world in with him, leaving behind a silent, magnificent, and utterly desolate kingdom of clay.